Welcome. Thank you for watching this teaching video from Oak Tree Community Church in South Bend, Indiana. Please check out our other videos and don't forget to like and subscribe. Our mission is to help people come to know Jesus better and love Him more every day. We believe this will not only help our own spiritual growth, but also help us better influence the community and the world for Christ. For more information about Oak Tree, please visit us at oaktreechurch.com. There you'll find past message series, online giving options, and more information about our discipleship process that we call The Path. Now enjoy this message. We'd love to hear from you in the comments or the website contact form. Thank you.
Morning, church. There we go. How's everyone doing today? Good. Perfect. So today we're going to be continuing on in our series that cleverly is the more you know, the more you obey. The premise is that for the last several weeks, we had gone over a knowledge series, right? Learning how to know the Bible, how to know more things. And as we're going through this year, we're talking about seasons of growth, and we're using the path as our example. And after knowledge is self-control. And now that we're into springtime outside, we're also in springtime on the path. And part of that is that we should be showing some signs of growth. What's the biggest sign of growth? Is obedience. So, we need to make sure that we are no longer infants, right? No longer are we people who don't know anything. But, like I showed you guys last week with Jonah, knowledge is not enough. Jonah was the only one in the entire book who didn't obey. He was also the only one who had the most knowledge of God. But we also saw a couple really cool things last week. We saw an encouragement that God still gets His goals done despite our disobedience. And the most important encouragement we saw last week is that God doesn't give up. Jonah disobeyed God again and again and again, until everyone was laughing when I said, hey, guess what? Jonah disobeyed again. But what was one thing we saw? God never gave up on Jonah. And just like Jonah, we disobey again and again and again. And we like to think that we've given up our chances. But God hasn't given up on us. All of you are still here today, which means God still gave you a chance. So, I told you last week, we're going to be going through some people you know, but some people in this series you might not know. And this week, we're going to look at Jonathan. And if I just say Jonathan, I might get some people nodding, and I might get some blank stares. And I can see a little bit of both. And it's okay if you don't know, because guess what? Jonathan is not a prophet. He doesn't have a book named after him. He's not a big focal point in the Bible. But he's a key person in the life of King David. And I know you know that name. And the cool thing about Jonathan is that he demonstrated a remarkable amount of obedience and loyalty to David and to God. So what I want to show you today through the life of Jonathan is a couple things. The first thing is that sometimes obedience requires sacrifice. Jonathan was obedient despite knowing what it would cost him and despite never getting to see the outcome. But also, one other thing I want to show you today, and I want you guys to pay attention for this, is that sometimes obedience looks like disobedience. What do I mean by that? Well, we know that God and the world don't always agree. So sometimes obedience to one is disobedience to the other. So, with that out of the way, who was Jonathan? I said he's related to King David. He's also related to King Saul, another name I'm sure you all have heard. And here's the cool thing about it. Jonathan was the son of King Saul. And he was also David's brother-in-law and a very, very close personal friend. So yes, he might not be as big as those two, but from that standpoint, he was as closely related to both of them as you could get. So before we get into who Jonathan was today a little more, I actually want to take a step back and give you guys a little bit of background. It might take a minute, but I promise you it'll help explain why Jonathan did what he did. So first of all, let's give some background on Saul. Who was King Saul? Saul was the very first king of Israel. Before Israel even had a king, they had a kingdom. But they were actually what we call a theocracy. What this means is that God was the leader. Why is that important? Well, because for a very long time, God was the sole leader of Israel. He gave his decrees through the high priest. They wore a special suit called an ephod, which had some stones that when they had a big decision to make, they could come to God and say, God, here is what we need to do. What decision should we use? Here's 12 examples. Pick a stone, and that'll be this decision. And so they would go, and God would make the decision for the nation, and the nation would obey. Sometimes. We know the history of Israel, right? They set up small judges to lead different areas. Every time they started to disobey, God said, when you disobey, this is going to happen. They disobeyed. Why is this happening to us? Because God said it would happen to you. God would send judges and leaders to rescue them over and over, and there would be a cycle and a cycle. Eventually, Israel started looking around and going, hey, every other nation around us has a king. All these nations are powerful. All these nations that keep taking us over. Maybe it's because they have a king and we don't, that they're winning. So they went to God and said, we want a king just like everyone else. And God said, you want one just like everyone else? Okay. What's the problem with that? Every other king did not rule for the benefit of the nation. Every other king ruled for their own benefit. They took tribute, they took taxes, they made petty decisions based on what would benefit them and the people that were supporting them, not what would benefit the nation as a whole. But hey, Israel said, we want one like everyone else. And God loves giving people exactly what they want. Not always what we really need. And so God decided, okay, you like Saul? Saul's going to be your king. The problem is, oh wait, Saul was just like everyone else. Who would have guessed? And so, Saul started off okay, and as he got more comfortable in his position, he started to be just like everyone else. Not only did he not do things for the benefit of the nation, but he did not do things to obey God. And eventually, he disobeyed God for the final time. And God sent him a message saying, I'm taking the king away from you. I'm taking the kingdom away. You will no longer be king. Your descendants will never be king. And he did this through the prophet Samuel. And one thing I actually want to look at is the actual interaction there, because it's very kind of key, and it ties into our obedience series. What happened is, in 1 Samuel 15, God had told Saul, here's an enemy of Israel. They've been doing things to my people, and I will have my revenge on them. And Saul, as my representative, as the king of Israel, you are going to go and wipe them out completely. So Saul went, God gave them victory, and Saul said, you know, they have some really nice stuff here. They have some really good things, and I could get a lot of money if I kept some of their leaders alive. So he did not obey God. He did not wipe them out. He did not destroy all their possessions. He wanted to keep it, give it to himself, give it to his friends in the army, make himself a more popular person. Then when the prophet arrived and said, why didn't you do what God said? He did what we like to do. Well, I was saving this for God. I was actually going to give all these things to God. I was going to offer them as sacrifices. So here was God's response through the prophet Samuel, and we see this in chapter 15, verses 22 and 23. It says, does the Lord take pleasure in burnt offerings and sacrifices, as much as he does in obedience? Certainly obedience is better than sacrifice. Paying attention is better than the fat of rams. For rebellion is like the sin of divination, and presumption is like the evil of idolatry. Because you have rejected the Lord's orders, he has rejected you from being king. What do you know? Obedience is what made Saul lose his position. Maybe there's a reason we're doing a series on obedience. Maybe it is an important thing. So, after he disobeyed, God said, I have rejected you as king, which means God has chosen a new king. Who is that new king? David, King David, yep. So, the series is not about David. I could do a whole series on David. Pastor could do a whole year on David. But David's not our focal point today, so I'm just going to quickly give a little bit of background. The simple explanation is that God chose David, a humble shepherd boy. He made him king. However, he didn't immediately remove Saul as king. So now you have a political king and a chosen king by God. I'm sure Saul's happy to just give up his kingdom to David, right? The guy who disobeyed God for more gain? No, he wasn't. Even though God chose David, because he left Saul in charge, that led to Saul being in charge actually for years and years after David was anointed. And that was years and years of back and forth between Saul trying to kill David and David getting away. And why did Saul try to kill David? Because he had a son who he wanted to be king. The name of that son was Jonathan. And that's where we get to Jonathan today. Because you see, unlike his father, Jonathan was actually loyal to David. From the very beginning, we see that. In 1 Samuel 18, verses 3 and 4, it says, Jonathan made a covenant with David, for he loved him as much as he did his own life. Jonathan took off the robe he was wearing and gave it to David, along with the rest of his gear, including his sword, his bow, and even his belt. This might not seem like much today to us. We share clothes all the time. We give our clothes to other people. We give our things. We let people borrow. But back then, this was significant. Jonathan, son of the king, next in line to rule, took off his own belongings, the things that symbolized him as the ruler, the next in line, and put it on David. By doing this, he declared David to be his equal, or, depending on how you look at that, more important than him. He gave him the status as next in line. So, we see right away, Jonathan was loyal to David. He knew David would be the next king, not himself. So how does this play out? Well, guess what? Like I said, Saul didn't like what God did. And so Saul decided, how am I going to make sure that David doesn't become king? I'm going to kill him. But Jonathan did not go along with it. In 1 Samuel 19, verses 1 to 7, I want to show you what happened here. It says, Then Saul told his son Jonathan and all his servants to kill David. But Saul's son Jonathan liked David very much. So Jonathan told David, My father Saul is trying to kill you, so be careful tomorrow morning. Find a hidden place and stay in seclusion. I will go out and stand beside my father in the field where you are. I will speak to my father about you. When I find out what the problem is, I will let you know. So Jonathan spoke out on David's behalf to his father Saul. He said to him, The king should not sin against his servant David, for he has not sinned against you. On the contrary, his actions have been very beneficial for you. He risked his life when he struck down the Philistine, and the Lord gave all Israel a great victory. When you saw it, were you happy? So why would you sin against innocent blood by putting David to death for no reason? Saul accepted Jonathan's advice and took an oath. As surely as the Lord lives, he will not be put to death. Then Jonathan called David and told him all these things. Jonathan brought David to Saul, and he served him as he had done formerly. So, what do we see here? First of all, Jonathan did not go along with his father to kill David. In fact, Jonathan went to David and said, Hey, here's what my father's planning. Here's what you're going to do. It wasn't David who said, Can you do this favor for me? Jonathan said, Here's what my father's doing. Don't worry, I already have a plan to protect you. I'm already planning to go against him. But he was able to talk to his father. He was able to convince him. So for now, up until this point, Jonathan has been able to both A, obey God, B, obey his father. He didn't actually go against him. He talked to him and convinced him to fall in line. However, his father's kind of stubborn. And so, again, Saul decides that it's time to kill David. And this time, Jonathan had to choose a side. And guess what? He chose David. We see this in 1 Samuel chapter 20. Because this time, Saul said, I will kill him. I have to. And David knows this. And David says, I need to get away from here. But by law, I'm required to be in his presence. So him and Jonathan hatched a plan. Hey, I'm going to go to my family to do this worship thing instead. Will you tell your father that's where I am? And you'll see his reaction. That'll tell you, is he actually going to try to kill me this time? And so they did that. And then starting in verse 28, we see Saul asking, Where is David? And here's Jonathan's response. In verse 28 of chapter 20, Jonathan replied to Saul, David urgently requested that he be allowed to go to Bethlehem. He said, Permit me to go, for we are having a family sacrifice in the town, and my brother urged me to be there. So now if you have found favor, If I have found favor with you, let me go to see my brothers. For that reason he has not come to the king's table." Saul became angry with Jonathan and said to him, "You stupid traitor, don't I realize that to your own disgrace and to the disgrace of your mother's nakedness, you have chosen this son of Jesse? For as long as this son of Jesse is alive on the earth, you and your kingdom will not be established. Now send some men and bring him to me, for he is as good as dead." Jonathan responded to his father Saul, "Why should he be put to death? What has he done?" Then Saul threw his spear at Jonathan in order to strike him down. So Jonathan was convinced that his father had decided to kill David. Jonathan got up from the table enraged. He did not eat anything on that second day of the new moon, for he was upset that his father had humiliated David. So what do we see here? Jonathan not only disobeyed his father, he not only chose David, he lied to his father. He lied to the king, and he did all this despite knowing, as his own father said, as long as David's alive, you don't get the kingdom. As long as David's alive, none of the things that I want for you are going to happen. That seems like a pretty good argument to most people. Why aren't you following me? As long as this guy's alive, you can't do this. But as soon as he dies, you get everything in front of you. However, this didn't sway Jonathan at all. At the end of chapter 20, after leading David away and letting him know, hey, here's what my father's planning to do. I have to get you away from here for your own safety. Jonathan reminds David of an oath between them. We see this at the end of chapter 20 still, in verse 42. Jonathan said to David, "Go in peace, for the two of us have sworn together in the name of the Lord, saying, 'The Lord will be between me and you, and between my descendants and your descendants forever.'" Jonathan had made an oath to God with David, and he was keeping that oath. One final time, while David was on the run, he was feeling discouraged this time. Years and years of being hunted by the ruling authority would probably do that to you. So what happens? Jonathan finds out David's discouraged, and he personally seeks David out to encourage him. And we see this in 1 Samuel 23, 16 to 18. Where is it? I don't have that one on here. Then Jonathan, son of Saul, left and went to David at Horesh. He encouraged him through God. He said to him, "Don't be afraid, for the hand of my father Saul cannot find you. You will rule over Israel, and I will be your second in command. Even my father Saul realizes this." When the two of them had made a covenant before the Lord, David stayed at Horesh, but Jonathan went to his house. So, once again here, Jonathan is recognizing that God chose David. Doesn't matter what anyone else chose. But the cool thing here is Jonathan didn't just recognize it. Because remember what I said last week. Obedience is not just a physical thing. Jonah went and said, "Okay, God said to do this, I'm going to do this." Obedience was a heart issue. Not only did Jonathan say, "You are going to be king," but he went and encouraged David about it. He said, "Don't be discouraged. I know you will be king. I support that. I know God has chosen this. My father can't stop it. No one can stop it." That was true obedience. Not only did he know what God wanted, he wanted what God wanted. He encouraged the person who was starting to fail in his faith at that point. David was starting to get discouraged. When will I become king? When will this happen? It's been years. And Jonathan took that opportunity to go and be God's encouragement to David. And again, Jonathan did this in spite of knowing that he was against his father, and in spite of knowing that if David became king, he would never be king. But he was willing to do this. He was obedient. So, what does Jonathan teach us about obedience? First of all, I want to remind, what's the first thing I said at the beginning? Jonathan teaches us that obedience requires sacrifice. Jonathan knew that God had chosen David, but like I keep saying, this support came at a cost. And here's the total cost of it. First of all, he had to go against his own father. He had to go against the king of the nation, and he had to go against the will of some of the people. Because humanly speaking, Jonathan was next in line. And there were a lot of people that still supported his family. A lot of people. If you read through all of 1st and 2nd Samuel, you'll see that when David does become king, there's still a lot of people who are loyal to Saul's line, who would have supported Jonathan if he chose. Instead, he chose to throw it all away and support David. We know that God would have gotten his way and David was always going to be the next king because God said so. But from a human standpoint, it looked like Jonathan was taking a big loss for nothing. And yet, we don't see one instance in all of Samuel of Jonathan ever regretting this decision. Jonathan did everything every time in order to support David and support God's choice. In fact, his father said that you're basically spitting in my face, in the face of your mother, in order to do this. His own father tried to kill him for supporting David. And yet, instead of making that, he went even more and supported David. That was a lot of sacrifice from Jonathan. The other thing that Jonathan teaches us is that, guess what? Sometimes we don't get to see the outcome of our obedience. What was that oath Jonathan made? Hey, I know you're going to become king, and because you and I are very close, I will be under you. I will be in charge of all your affairs. That's not how history happened. Unfortunately, when Saul was finally killed, it was during a battle, and Jonathan was killed right along with him. Despite all his support, despite everything, despite waiting for David to be king, Jonathan never actually lived to see David become king. He never got to see the benefit from his obedience. But guess what? God saw it. Guess who else saw it? Every single person who has read the Bible from then until now. Jonathan is recorded forever in the Bible as one of the most loyal and obedient people in the history of Israel. Again, going against his own birthright, his own father, to obey. And even though he didn't live to see it, his obedience is what helped David ascend the throne. He's the one who encouraged David. He's the one who saved David. He's the one who supported David. Because of his obedience, David ascended the throne. And because of the oath that he made with David and David made with him, when David ascended the throne, some of his supporters wanted to get rid of Saul's line. But David honored that, and even though Jonathan never lived to see it, his descendants lived to see it. David protected Jonathan's descendants. All of these things happened because of Jonathan's obedience. And the final thing I told you about earlier for obedience is that obedience looks like disobedience, right? What do I mean by that? Well, it's not that Jonathan ever disobeyed God. Jonathan was always obedient to God. He always supported David as God's chosen. However, he quite often went against his father. He quite often went against the political ruler. And at some point, a lot of people said, oh, God had put David in charge. God had put Saul in charge. So a lot of people still thought that Saul was the religious leader. Jonathan went against his father personally, politically, religiously. And every time he had to choose, he chose God. I like the best example of this in the Bible is actually all the way in the New Testament, in Acts chapter 5. And in Acts chapter 5, Peter and the other apostles were out preaching about Jesus after he had died, had been resurrected, and after Pentecost. They were out there preaching every day, and the high priest didn't like that. They arrested them, and after a very long interrogation, they released them, but warned them, hey, we're going to release you, but you're not allowed to go and talk about Jesus anymore. So guess what? The next day, the apostles went out and started talking about Jesus again. They were brought back before the high priest, and the high priest went, what the heck? We just released you. We just told you the only thing is you can't talk about Jesus. Why'd you do that again? And their response was, and I don't know why my slides are off again. In Acts 5:29, Peter and the apostles replied, we must obey God rather than people. That's what they did. That's what Jonathan did. and that's what we must do. However, I do want to make this a quick warning. This is not a get-out-of-jail-free card for disobeying authority. Because the Bible makes it very clear that every authority on earth is under God, but also every authority on earth has been allowed by God. And we are told as Christians that we need to submit ourselves to authority and be as obedient as possible in every way. What does it mean, every way possible? It means that whenever someone in authority who has been placed in an authority over us tells us to do something and it does not go directly against God or explicitly against the Bible, we should do that. Christians are under a higher standard of obedience than anyone else in the world. But guess what? We're also under a higher standard of obedience to God. Whenever anyone in authority tells you to do something that you know is against God or you know is against the Bible, you are to disobey that authority and to obey God. That's what disobedience looks like obedience means. Whenever somebody goes against God, you are to obey God rather than the authority. But in every circumstance in our life, whether that is the authority or God, we are to be obedient. So what does that mean today for us? Just like Jonathan, sometimes our obedience requires us to make sacrifices. We might have to choose between getting a better job or doing better service to God, between supporting a biblical policy or losing a job or losing friends or losing family or whatever. In fact, I'm pretty sure every one of us, if we haven't already, will face that kind of choice in our lives. Not only that, but many places around the world, they are facing that. Many Christians in many countries are having to choose between the law of the land and the law of God. Because many laws from the beginning of the Bible to the present day are anti-biblical. We know that the world is against God. And so our choice is obey God or obey the world. Guess what? We might be like Jonathan. We might spend our whole lives obeying and waiting, and I know this is going to be the outcome, and you don't get to see the outcome. But that doesn't mean those around you don't. Sometimes the outcome of your obedience is not for you, it's for others. Does that mean you shouldn't do it? No. It means you are still obeying God and following His plan, knowing that what He's having you do is help somebody else. Your obedience might be the catalyst for somebody else. No matter what situation, all of us will eventually be put in that place where we have to choose. And I'm not saying obedience is easy. We started with Jonah for a reason, to show you that obedience is not always natural. It's not always easy. Just because you know who God is doesn't mean you're going to obey Him. But we are expected to obey. Part of that path, part of that growth process is the expectation that the more we know Him, the more we will obey Him. As we grow in our faith, obedience should come out of that growth. But we have to be careful that we don't say, if I'm not obeying, it means I'm not growing. If I'm not doing that, it means I'm not maturing. What we need to do is mature, obey, mature some more, obey some more. That's why we call it the path. That's why we say it's a lifelong process. So, what does that mean? Well, it means that each of us has a choice to make today. First thing is, are we going to put our interests first, or are we going to put God's? Obedience sometimes means doing exactly what we don't want to do. Not just doing something because we have to. It means you know exactly that the thing you don't want to do, that's exactly what you must do. And that's the choice. It's easy to obey when obedience lines up with what we want, right? I want to go get ice cream. God wants me to go out and talk to people. Well, I'm obeying God because I'm going out and talking to people. I want to fit in at work and not cause problems, but they're asking for a policy that's anti-biblical. Now you have a choice. Well, I want to do this, but in order to serve better, I should be doing this. Now we have a choice. problem is, what we want is not always what we need, right? Israel wanted a king like everyone else. They didn't need a king like everyone else. God knows best. God knows what's best for us. So even when we don't see the outcome, doesn't mean the outcome is not going to be what God intended. Doesn't mean it's not going to be better. And that's why we have to choose. Because if we could see the outcome, we'd be like God. And that's the thing. Number 2 is, are we going to obey when we don't see the outcome? Are we going to be like Jonathan, spending our whole lives obeying, not knowing what's happening? This isn't to say that every time you obey, you don't see the outcome immediately, because a lot of times the outcome is immediately obedient. If you choose, I'm not going to obey that red light, I'm going to go right now, you're going to see the outcome right away of that choice. But if you choose, I'm going to keep going and I'm going to dedicate more time to Bible study, even though I want to go do whatever else. Well, you might not see the outcome immediately, but we know that the eventual outcome is growth. So we have to choose to keep obeying again and again and again, not just when we know what the outcome is, but even more when we don't. And the final thing, and the most important, is, are we going to obey God or are we going to obey men? This is actually the hardest point. Because, it's easy to choose one or the other. Even when you have a choice, sometimes it's do this or do this, but that is only you being affected. But what about when it's obey the government or obey God? Obey your boss or obey God? Then other people are seeing this. And none of us want to cause trouble. None of us want to go out there and purposely disobey whatever authority. None of us want to deal with that. But the fact is, that's part of our lives as Christians. We are in the world, but not of the world. We are God's light in the world. We are the ones who are set apart. And if we are to be set apart, we have to live like we are set apart. And sometimes that means being different than those around, obeying different than those around. So no matter what we choose obedience. No matter what situation, choose obedience. And like Jonathan, your name might be recorded. You might not see it for yourself now, but I guarantee you in eternity you will see so many things that you didn't realize you were setting up. I really hope that that's encouraging for you guys. And that is kind of the point of this series. Obedience isn't easy. Sometimes it's not even the best thing, humanly speaking. But obedience is always the best thing in God's eyes. Like he said in Samuel, does God want sacrifice? Does God want gifts? No, he wants obedience. He wants your heart.